And it came to pass in the 4th year of King Darius that the word of Yah came unto Zechariah in the 4th day of the 9th month, even in Chesleu, when they had sent unto the house of Elohim Sharezer and Ragamalek and their men to pray before Yahweh and to speak unto the priest which were in the house of Yahweh of hosts, and to the prophet, saying, should I weep in the 5th month, separating myself as I have done these so many years? In the 4th year of King Darius, this was well past the time of the 70-year captivity that Israelites had been in ancient Babylon, as they had been brought captive by King Nebuchadnezzar. And the history shows us that the Babylonians destroyed our city, destroyed our culture, destroyed our temple, and they just annihilated our nation. And that date, Tish B'Av, the 9th day of the 5th month, that the whole time they were in Babel, they would fast at that time on that date. And they've been doing that for the duration of the 70 years that they had been in ancient Babel, that they would do Tish B'Av, fasting. Now, there was no Torah-based instruction for this, of course. Torah was given long before the destruction of Jerusalem. And of course, for them to have been repenting and praying and fasting while they're enduring the circumstances and the consequences of their actions that resulted in that captivity to Babylon. They had been told, they had been warned. Yah said he had been raising the prophets up early, testifying to them. And they weren't listening. They didn't pay attention, and they just committed themselves to doing evil. And so once the consequences for that evil happened, and the recollection of how tragic their circumstances were, they decided to commemorate the date that Jerusalem was destroyed on the 9th day of the 5th month every year. Now, when we come to this section, though, in chapter 7 of Zechariah, this is well after the 70 years had ended, and some of them had returned back to Jerusalem. The temple was being rebuilt. The city was being rebuilt. And houses and culture and the society for Israelites was being restored. So as that was going on, surprisingly, well, maybe not so surprising. As you know, Israelites, now you'll still know them then. If today the word was, all right, all you Israelites in America, the latter-day Babylon, it's time for you to go back to your homeland. Do you think most Israelites left to themselves would go back to their homeland, or would most of them stay here in America? I think we know what the answer is to that. Because that was what the answer was back then in this case. Most of them stayed behind in Babylon. they got comfortable and entrenched in Babylonian culture. And I must say, that in terms of just the comfort zones and the leisure and luxury of any place on the earth, I can't think of any place on the earth that surpasses the leisure luxury of America, even with all of its corruptions and wickedness and evil. And once Israelites get into that pattern, and it's a deceptive pattern to say, well, I'm just good here. I'm good. You know, I don't need to go nowhere. Well, if that were the case today, that most wouldn't go back, so was the case back then. And this time, around the time of 530 BC, most Israelites were still in Babylon. There was a remnant, though, that had gone back. Now, what we have in our lesson tonight is verse 2. There were two from those who remained back in Babylon that decided, well, you know, Jerusalem's open again for worship, and the Persians are in control, and they don't mind if we go to Jerusalem to worship, but we'll just go to visit, and then we'll go back to Babylon, you know, but we'll just go to visit. And so two of them, one's name is Sharezer, another one is Ragamelech. These are some Israelites still living in Babylon, but they said, you know, at some point they said, let's do a pilgrimage, not to stay in Jerusalem, just to go visit and do the feast days, you know, be there in the time of the feast days. So they're asking a question actually at the end of the fall feast period, which, you know, fall feast ends usually, you know, in the fall. And these guys had been there for the fall festival, Sukkot, because it tells us the time that they were there. They were there in the 9th month, which would be equivalent to the Julian calendar, November. And the Hebrew calendar would be the 9th month. All right, so they're looking at going back to Babylon, and so they go in the temple and they ask the priest. They said, well, you know, and I'm just surmising how it could have been they were talking. They're saying, you know, we're getting ready to go back, but since you all are here, living in Jerusalem again and in the land of Israel again, when we go back, should we tell the people still in Babylon, should we tell them that there's no need for them to do the fast prayer on Tish B'Av anymore? You know, that's over. We don't need to do that anymore. That's the question they're asking when they said, verse 3, to speak unto the priests which were in the house of Yah of hosts, and to the prophets saying, should I weep in the 5th month, separating myself as I has done these so many years? So for so many years since the diaspora and the exile to Babylon, they were still doing this fast on Tish B'Av. But the question now they're saying is, well, are we doing basically better now? I mean, there's some of us back and we're doing good in Babylon. We got a friendly emperor of the Persians that's cool with Hebrews. So should we still be fasting at Tish B'Av? That's the question. And you know, today, I understand that some of these commemoration days like Tish B'Av or Hanukkah or Purim, these are not in the Torah. These are not Torah laws that are commanded to do. And yet, we see our people were doing these. And clearly, there was no prophet telling them. Jeremiah didn't tell them when they left and went there, well, every 9th day of the 5th month, y'all need to do a fast, Tish B'Av. And Ezekiel, the prophet who was there in Babylon, he never told them every 5th month, the 9th day, that we should do a fast. Yeah, we're not told how they began to do this, but they were doing it. That's clear from what we read in chapter 7, verse 3. They were doing this fast. Okay, now, if it wasn't bad enough that things happened on Tish B'Av for the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, we know 500 years later, roughly, the Romans came and destroyed our city and our nation again. And on the records of history we have, as recorded in the annals of the 1st century Hebrew historian Josephus, he says that Rome destroyed Jerusalem on that same date, Tish B'Av, the same date that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem nearly 50 years, 500 years before. Now, since that time, down to this time, there have been Israelites in certain parts of the world that now are observing Tish B'Av for 2 reasons. One, the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC by the Babylonians. And then again, on Tish B'Av, the same date, different year, 500 years later, in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed again on that same date by the Romans. Some surmised that maybe the Romans did that on purpose to really, rub it in. How you were destroyed once on this date, and now we're here to destroy you again on this date. All right, and so now, down through history, Israelites in different diasporas would fast and pray on this date down to this time. Now, you and I, all of us on this Zoom tonight, all we have had to see of those doing it were people that don't look like us, Jewish people, right? And again, we tend to think, well, some of our people think, well, anything they do, I'm not going to do. But I always go by this phrase, you got to look at that. There were other people of us that were commemorating it that did look like us as well down through history. Because we know we had people in Yemen, Africa, that did observe this destruction date, particularly in Yemen, in Hebrews in Egypt, North Africa in particular. And there's extensive records of them. And they, if you read the book by Rudolph Windsor, From Babylon to Timbuktu, he clearly shows this. Just read that book. Most of us have that classic. All right. So without looking at it from the perspective that this is something foreign to a Hebrew Israelite in America to review and focus and concentrate upon, would be akin to what these brothers are asking here in Zechariah chapter 7. They say, should we be doing this? Now, this is going to be interesting. The priest went ahead and presented that question to Yah himself. And we read in verse 4, starting in verse 4 of Zechariah chapter 7, it says, "Then came the word of Yah of hosts unto me, saying, Speak unto all the people of the land and to the priests, saying, When you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th month, even those 70 years, did ye at all fast unto me, even to me?" Now, Yah's first response is, not only is he calling into question their motives and reasons for the fast on Tish B'Av in the 5th month, he's even calling on their reason and motive for the Torah-based fast that's done in the 7th month on the Hebrew calendar, Yom Kippur. So he said, well, it's not just, am I calling into account why you are doing it at Tish B'Av on the 9th day of the 5th month. I'm calling into question. He's saying, well, what is your motive behind why you're doing Yom Kippur when you fast on that day in the 7th month? So what is Yah saying with this? Well, it's as though the date or the timing of the fast that Israelites did is not what he's calling into question. Whether it's in the 5th month or whether it's in the Torah-based fast of Yom Kippur, that's in Leviticus chapter 23. What Yah's calling into question is not the dates of the fast. He's calling into account the motives of the heart of Israelites in these fasts. That's what he's calling into account, And we read on where he continues to say in verse 6, "And when you did eat, and when you did drink, did not you eat for yourselves and drink for yourself?" Now he's talking about the other festivals that Israel had where they weren't fasting, but they were feasting. So basically he's calling into account their whole reasoning and motives of their hearts, whether they were fasting or whether they were feasting. And it's so it means that people that just do these feast days like clockwork, like, well, I'm supposed to do this that day because this is what it said they did, so I'm gonna do it. Okay. Yet their hearts aren't in what they're doing, because it can be demonstrated by their character and behavior. For one, verse 7 says, "Should you not hear the words which Yah cried by the former prophets when Jerusalem was inhabited and in prosperity, and the cities thereof round about her when men inhabited the south and the plain?" Now Yah's reminding Israelites, yeah, y'all were doing these fasts, and you all were doing these feasts, while at the same time you were doing wickedness and evil towards me and towards one another. And yet you were doing these festivals. Basically, he's saying it's the condition of the heart behind these fasts or these feasts that he's looking at. And evidently, they were still doing these fasts and feasts like Yom Kippur, or feasts like Sukkot, while they were still murdering their own babies, while they were spilling blood between one another, black on black crime. They were still doing these feasts while they were worshiping idols. And Yah is saying, well, just doing these feast days is not what he's calling for. He's calling for the motives, the pure hearts, the sincerity, and the love, and the truth, and the justice that should be between each other during these feasts. And he said they didn't listen to the words of the prophets. Like, they told them, you all are doing these feasts, but you're doing it in vain because you're doing wickedness and evils. Y'all not paying attention to what you're doing. So this is what Yah says that really makes the fast relevant, whether it's Tish B'Av, whether it's any day we fast or commemorate for repentance for what we did wrong. Verse 8 says, and the word of Yah came unto Zechariah, saying, thus speaketh Yahweh, saying, execute true judgment and show mercy and compassion, every man to his brother, and oppress not the widow, nor the fatherless, the stranger, nor the poor, and let none of you imagine evil against his brother in your heart. But they refused to hearken and pulled away the shoulder and stopped their ears that they should not hear. Yeah. In other words, they were practicing religion. They were doing something religious. And, you know, Elder Levan and I know we religiously get our work out in every day. I know I do. I do it religiously. But now, that means I'm just doing something over and over and over. But now, when it comes in the spirit realm, it's not the regularity of these fasts or feasts. It's the heart of the people in these fasts and feasts. And I must call this out because we had a feast a couple of months ago, and people's hearts weren't right with one another. There were some people whose hearts were right with one another. But there were some people whose hearts weren't right with one another. Why are you going to do a feast and you can't even come together face to face? Why are you going to do a festival and have nerve enough to act like you're doing it? Though most of us that were there were doing it in the right heart. But Yah said, I don't pay attention to nobody's observance or any of this like that. And they refused to listen, and they made their hearts hard. So he said, verse 12, yea, they made their hearts as an adamant stone, lest they should hear the law and the words which Yahweh of hosts have sent in his spirit by the former prophets. Therefore came a great wrath from Yahweh of hosts. It's dangerous to come into Yah's sacrifices of praise, or when our hearts aren't right with one another. Didn't Yahshua say, if your heart's not right with your brother and you're doing your sacrifice, lay your sacrifice aside and get with that brother or that sister? That's what Yahshua told us. He said, leave that sacrifice, leave that festival observance, get right with that person first. Well, if people don't want to get right with each other and they're in the same area, and then they're in different rooms or different locations on the same property, I must bear witness. Yah is saying he does not like that, and he always does consequences for things like that. Always. This is why he says, verse 13, therefore it came to pass that as he cried, they would not hear. So they cried, and I would not hear, saith Yah of hosts. And I scattered them with a whirlwind among the nations whom they knew not. Thus the land was desolate after them, that no man passed through, no return. for they laid the pleasant land desolate. Eventually, the civilization of Israelites was so bad leading up to the last Tish B'Av, when the Romans came to destroy Jerusalem. And the same message that Yah is saying here in the time of the aftermath of the Babylonian destruction is the same message that he said applies for the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Yah said it results in devastation, because Yahshua said the Father is looking for such as will worship him in spirit and in truth, whether it's fasting, whether it's feasting. This is why when the Samaritan woman said to Yahshua, well, you're a Yahudi, you all say Jerusalem is where we should worship, where worship should be. We're Samaritans. We say here in this mount, here in Samaria is where we should worship. Yahshua said to her, he said, woman, I tell you, neither here nor there will the true worshipers be found. In other words, he's saying in that time, Jerusalem was still going through the motions that would lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And by the time the Romans came down, there is the record of General Titus, the Roman general. He brought his soldiers down towards Jerusalem. And in the record of the narrative of the history of Josephus, it said Jerusalem was divided up in three factions by three gang chiefs. One group was called the Sakari. These are the ones that really were devastatingly deadly with knives. And they had their own gang chiefs. And these people were fighting for who would be the king of Jerusalem. They were fighting each other. And if you were with that gang, then, you know, you'd be pulling for that chief. And there was three of them. And it is documented. The Roman general Titus saw that from a distance with his intelligence. And he told his soldiers, stop, don't go down there. Let them kill themselves off first. Then we just can come down and mop it up. They'll destroy each other first before we come in there and destroy them. This is why Yahshua was saying, you know, if I'm looking for such a worship in spirit and in truth. Now, as a result, by the time the Romans did come down on Tish B'Av and destroyed Jerusalem, we had pretty much destroyed ourselves for the most part, just like we're doing each other now in these cities with these chiefs. You know, we're doing the same thing now. And same strategy. The adversary said, let them be, give them all the weapons they need to destroy each other. Give them guns, all the guns they need. That's why we had trains coming into Chicago that are just on the track. The train's open and there's nothing but guns and rifles in the train. Like, seriously, this is documented. This happened a few years ago. And well, the message is clear. You all, we want you to destroy each other before we move in with our own martial law. Why waste our men when you are going to do it to yourselves? And see, that's what Yah is saying to the Israelites. Because just the other day we saw Israelites fighting on a street corner over a chair. We saw that. Some of you saw that on YouTube. And the Gentiles that had been attacking us, they just laughed. And they're the ones who put the video up. All right. Then the other day in Kansas City, I'm sure some of you heard this by now. Some of these brothers out here wolfing on the street corner, you know, Hebrew Israelites, wolfing on the street corner? Well, they were wolfing on the wrong street corner to the wrong people in the wrong neighborhood. And somebody who they offended came back and popped one of them with a gun. So you see, how can we satisfy Yah with anything when we are hostile and harassing to one another?